it is to be with you. I had forgotten how many friends that I already knew in this congregation, and so it's been so great to see some of your faces again. When she mentioned the term cozy noir, that was something I made up. Because when you deal with publishers, they always say, is it a cozy mystery? But to me, it's not really a cozy mystery if it doesn't have a cat on the cover and a bookstore and a cup of tea. And so they don't have that. And so I sort of combined it with noir, which is a darker thing. So that's kind of what they are. People ask me all the time, what are you doing? Why are you writing murder mysteries? Why aren't you writing discipleship books or like Beth Moore or those kinds of things? Karen Armstrong says novels can serve a moral function by enabling us to enter the lives of others imaginatively. Novels force us to experience the terror of illness, sorrow, poverty, and infirmity. They enhance our compassion by compelling us to feel with others. Quite frankly, novels, fiction, story, narrative is the only way the world makes sense to me. And so that is why I deal almost exclusively with that. Now, I would like to know who wrote your mission statement. Is that person in here by any chance?
Well, the vision statement or the mission statement? The session works together on that statement over a period of about a year, and I kind of compiled what they all came up with.
Bunch of people crafting it. It is excellent, absolutely excellent. You're probably all familiar with this, but I love them. I think what's so important is missional, the missional church, living the gospel of reconciliation, especially those in serving Christ, our people, especially those who suffer, struggle, and doubt.
I should say the session and the diaconate actually was a whole, it was both works working together.
And I'm telling you, this kind of writing is the hardest there is. Is that Lance? Yeah. You know better than that. God don't have to try you. People there used to say, I don't know how in the world you can preach. Because there would be 30 people going to the bathroom. There would be somebody going to the bathroom and hitting drums as they walk by. There would be outbursts. There would be phones going on. So you can't bother me. But anyway, the idea that you have in your mission statement, especially those who suffer, struggle, and doubt. Because I think one of the biggest mysteries of being human is why do we struggle? Why do we suffer? And then a second mystery to that is why do some of us struggle and suffer so much more than others? I had a woman that I knew, and within moments of meeting you, she would tell you that her mother had quite literally thrown her into a dumpster when she was a newborn. And she was rescued by a neighbor who kind of took her and raised her. But this woman was in her 50s by the time I met her. But that was her identity. That's what she would tell you, that my mother threw me away. My goodness. You know, how do some of us live through that while others of us are swaddled, taken home from the hospital with all the love and care in the world? We're not really going to solve that mystery this weekend, but I would like us to think about and deal with how we as the church then lives alongside the people who struggle and suffer so much, and what are our responsibilities. How do we live in this world knowing that there are a lot of people like this? A mystery, or the third, I guess, mystery, I want us to think about is our Bible, our whole. When I went to seminary, of course, I had no idea of becoming a minister at that point. I would just taken on the religion beat with Sprinkle News, and I just went down to Erskine to learn more about what I was writing about. But I thought, okay, I'm going to go to seminary, and I'm going to find out who wrote the Bible, how it was put together, I honestly thought, it's been 2,000 years. Surely these guys have this figured out by now. Oh my gosh, it is the biggest mystery in the world of who wrote these books of the Bible, how it came together. There is mystery surrounding every single piece of it. So, mysteries are us. Mysteries are us. Because as readers looking at a document that goes back from 2,000 years to 4,500 years, the Bible may not always say exactly what we think it's saying. Now, what do I mean by that? We have a different mindset than, because we are on this side of technology and the Industrial Revolution and 10 million things. We think differently than the ancients thought. If I go out in my backyard and I find a dead tree, I'm going to think, oh, okay, the roots hit one of the underground springs in my yard and drowned. Or the roots are fighting that red clay and gray clay in my yard. Oops, and so I'll pull it up and try to do something different. If an ancient walked out into his backyard and found a dead tree, he would say, the demons got it. Totally different mindset. Furthermore, our view of history, how we think of history, is a very modern construct. There was a German historian only in the 19th century named Leopold von Ranke, and he's known as the father of objective writing of history. Before that, people did not hold themselves to these same standards. It just wasn't known that you followed facts, that history was objective. I remember finding out when some historians or fiction writers or civil activists had plagiarized. And I thought, that is the worst thing anybody could ever do. I don't know if y'all remember, but about, it's probably been 20 years or so, there was a young man who had been hired by the New York Times, Jason Blair, and they realized that he was making up stories. And they were sending him out, across the country, and he was either making up stories or he was completely lifting them from local reporters who were cutting them out. Well, I was just amazed by that this person who had been able to get a job at the New York Times, for goodness sakes, would do such a thing. So I was in the orthodontist office with my younger daughter, and it was like late on a Friday afternoon, we were getting ready to leave for the beach and had this appointment. And there was a Newsweek in there with this story, Jason Blair on the cover. And so, I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta read that story. So I took the magazine. And my daughter's like, aren't you studying to be a preacher? And I said, yes, I am, and we will return this before his patients get here on Monday morning. And so I had her read me the entire story on the way down. I had her read it again to me on the way back, because I was just mesmerized how somebody could do such a thing. That plagiarism was the worst thing you could do. Now, we did come in on Sunday night, and we went and put the magazine back through this slide. So calm down. But the ancients did not think that way. There was no concept of plagiarism. They freely they would write something and put somebody's name on it. And it might be a sign of respect. I'm a student of Peter, And so I'm gonna put his name on this letter. So people will read it. And so you have, and there was no concept of it being dishonest or anything like that. So again, same way with Paul's letters. We think, a lot of Paul's letters came from an apostle named Paul. And some of them just put his name on letters later, on other letters. So that kind of thing. So I think that's the first thing that we have to get past. Then I want us to think a little bit about how we approach different kinds of narratives. Okay? What is the difference in reading Ron Chernow, is that how you pronounce it? His biography of Alexander Hamilton, and in watching the musical Hamilton? What are the differences? One's got music. Yeah.
Perspective.
Perspective.
One's written for a screenplay.
Beg pardon?
One is written for a screenplay. A screenplay.
Yeah.
Actually, my students have writing an essay on the difference, and I would focus on what happened and what were other people and saying what was left out. Everybody else's story is contracted out and simplified in order to focus on Hamilton.
Absolutely. And the idea that, George Washington is black. And all the, Jefferson, in the version I saw, Jefferson was Asian American.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
She was whispering.
So, when we pick up a biography of somebody, our expectations are far different than when we go sit at the Peace Center and watch it, and watch this historical thing. Okay? So we know that, right? Going in. Okay? Think about the difference between Martin Luther King's Jr. I Have a Dream speech, okay, the poetry and the rhythms of the speech. Marshall Brady's biography of Dr. King. Dr. King's autobiography, so his version of his life story. And my little golden book about Martin Luther King Jr. Y'all remember the little? Okay, just think about it. We don't have to answer, but think about our expectations as we pick up each of those books. Vastly different, right? We know what we're doing when we pick up, the children's version of this historical figure. All right, now I want us to think about a daily newspaper. Okay, say that you're, now this isn't going to happen because we are a literate society and we write and write and write and write and write. And so anybody living in the year 4200 is going to have this complete written record. We have professors here, they're going to have this complete written record of us and going forward. But say it was somebody 2,000 years looking back on us, okay, in the same way that we are looking back on our biblical writers, who, by the way, which was not a terribly literate kind of science. Okay, so say somebody is trying to figure out who we were by picking up a daily paper, all right? SLED releases 911 call recordings. This is from the Murdoch case down in Hampton County, which I have been following like a crazy person. Does anybody doubt that SLED really released those calls? I don't doubt that. I heard most of them on a podcast. I'm 100% sure SLED released those. Okay, this is a story from the sports page about Spartanburg beating Riverside in a football game, 35-7. See anybody down? That really happened? No. I'm sorry, I didn't really get personal. Okay, Iranians in Tehran flock to see Warhol pop art exhibit. Does anybody doubt that there was actually an Andy Warhol exhibit in Tehran back in 2021? I don't. I mean, there's a picture of a patron there looking, and okay, but here we go. Letter to the editor. You can't read this without my glasses. The Textile Heritage Museum needs support for phase 3. And the writer is the chairman of the Greenville Textile Heritage Society. He's wanting money for this. Okay? Do I have to send him money? Is this a fact that I have? Yeah. This is what? What's the letter to the editor? One person's opinion. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay? Give me that. Okay. Foxtrot and Clovers. And in Foxtrot, Jason is, sending up lights, and he says, I got the idea from Batman. And his dad says, son, remind me to show you our electric bill sometime. Okay. Is that true? No. That kid really do that?
No.
See, it's almost ridiculous, isn't it? Because we know how to read a comic.
Well, some of those sluggers hit pretty close to home for me.
Yes. And this one is,
Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
You formulated the question. That's what
Yes.
I'm sorry. Well, you formulated the question this way. Is it true? And I would say, I read literature all the time and write literature all the time. I would say, yeah, it's true. Is it historically accurate? There's a difference, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's truth in myth, there's truth in narrative. It depends on, which I think is the point you're making here, it depends on how we read the text.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're getting a little more sophisticated than I was even going. So, but yeah, that's the road I'm on. But yeah. But I'm gonna be a little more basic right now. Okay, this is
You're quite calling yourself Beth. Your name's Beth.
it is Beth, but Beth, people call me Beth all the time. And I think that makes me up with Beth Templeton.
Oh,
But I mean all the time. So don't worry about it, I'll even answer Beth. Horoscope. Well, now this isn't a daily newspaper, so shouldn't it be factual? We know what we're doing, we know what we're getting when we do that. People think it is. Yes, they do. We're gonna ignore those people. Okay. Medicare approved new technology for knee arthritis treatment. And then this helpful little thing at the top, paid advertisement. Okay. Weather forecast. Complete fiction, right? There again. Now, do we think it really got the 78 on that? This is the day in October last year. And 7 at night? Maybe not, right? Okay, editorial page. Leonard Pitts. Leonard Pitts is a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, writes out of Miami. But he's writing about My People Are Americans, and it's talking about African American population. What's that? His opinion. Yeah, opinion. Right. His opinion. Okay, now this another cartoon. However, this one was on the editorial page, not the comic page. It shows Joe Biden and 2 donkeys fighting it out in a cage match. One saying they're progressives, one saying they're moderates. And he says, well, I did promise a change from the usual Democrats like Republicans. Is that a fact? Was Joe Biden really in that cage match? Okay. Real estate marketplace. The way waiting just for me. There's a section of the yard that is fenced for your pets to run footy or for your kids to play safely. Whether you want to grill out with friends, is that really mine? Anyway, you get my, okay, you're at it. You know, I hope it is. So, my point being, when we approach a daily newspaper, we instinctively know what we're looking at, even though it's all in the thing that you would think would be a newspaper, hence the name. It's not. Okay, and then my favorite, before I say anything about this, does anybody know a person named Ruth Ellen Bates Mitchell? That's not. Okay. Good, okay. This is the obituary page. And there are about, 8 people who died, and this is way back from 2016. And almost every one of them died or passed away, except one young man who entered the church triumphant. What's going on here? Theology. But what else? What does anybody know in relation to a newspaper? What had happened to newspapers? When I was a newspaper writer, we had to write obituaries as news story. So everybody died. They were news stories. The industry decided this is the way they were going to make money. And so obituaries are paid. So you say anything you want. And so if you wanted to enter the church triumphant, if you wanted to join Elijah in the golden chariot, you do it, because you're paid for it. And the reason I have kept this since 2016 is it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life. It's that woman I mentioned, and it goes this long. That cost thousands of dollars. But apparently it was written by the woman's daughter, who was named Tanya. Tanya mentions herself in 12 times. In her mother's obituary. So I read it out and took it to my children. I see your name 12 times and I owe it.
I want to read my obituary. I put myself in heaven, but that is one hell of a fiction, right?
We all ought to do that. I'll write our own obituary. This was just mind blowing. She talked a little bit about her mother, and then she talked about how Ruth Ellen and her daughter Tanya were more like sisters than parent and child. Ruth Ellen enjoyed spending time with her daughter, dressing alike. Tanya's musical talent was a joy to her parents. And then, 30 inches in, this whole thing is taking a terrible toll on Tanya. And then she goes back. They have always been more like sisters. And then she changes to first person. As we wore matching outfits to church, Ruth Ellen and Tanya loved each other. And it's just, and then finally, about, inch 40, Ruth Ellen is survived by her daughter, Tanya. Oh, really? So, anyway, back in my day, that wouldn't have gotten anywhere near a newspaper. Because, those were newspapers. Same thing with weddings, as a matter of fact. Weddings used to just be very, cut and dry. Except the bride was more Catholic. But yeah, and so now those are paid. So you have to know that to not be surprised when you read that kind of thing. Okay. So in the same way, we approach the Bible. My contention is that we approach the Bible like this newspaper. that we act as if everything is fact-based. And we're not differentiating between poetry and letters and history books and all the other things. So, let's see if I can, yeah, here we go. And this is very rough, and this is not in stone or anything, but in general, the Bible gives us some history, okay? But now ancient history, without our 19th century requirements, as Mark pointed out. So we have prehistory, which is Genesis 1 through 12. Those are the creation story, Noah, Tower of Babel, all those things that were really way, way back and had been passed down by the Hebrew people orally for many, many years, and then were gathered and written at some point. But it's really, there was prehistory. We have no idea when they were, okay? And then history, Genesis. This is, what a rich book. Beginning with our recorded history begins with the call of Abraham, okay? And then, as you know, then his sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and then Isaac's sons, Esau and Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel, and then how their brother Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. Okay, so that. Then Exodus, how God calls Moses to bring the children out of Egypt and into the promised land. And then Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, all them. Just more history about how they established, how they were God's people. Now, we as Jews and Christians and Muslims very much revere this history. Other cultures, not so much. One of the oddest things that I heard or learned was that King David, because when you read these books, you would, King David, it was the golden age of Israel. And then to some extent Solomon after, his son after him. But it just sounded like everybody in the world knew this kingdom and all. But there was no mention, unless there's been some in the past 50 years, there was no mention of King David found anywhere else. Not in the writings of the Assyrians or the Babylonians or any of the other cultures that day did not take notice of that King David that we, is so looms so large in our minds. The only thing I can think of that it would be like would be if you were reading a narrative from the view of our Native Americans or maybe Mormons. And so, everything is very looming large while the rest of the country is not really paying a lot of attention. It's not really on the radar of the rest of the country. And so that's kind of what this is. It's a very subjective history of this. Okay, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, of course, are stories about the rebuilding after the exile to Babylon and how they rebuild it. And then Acts, I guess, is the closest we have to a history. I know you talked from Acts last year. Yeah, I love it. It's one of my favorite books. It's sort of a history, but it's wild, isn't it? You have the Holy Spirit just bursting out all over the place. But I would say that's the closest the New Testament has to a history. Okay, and you have books of laws. We don't really read Leviticus and Deuteronomy like we read other things because they're laws. They tell about not eating shellfish. They tell about don't wear two different kinds of fibers and just, all the way up to do not kill and, the 10 Commandments and all that, the books of laws. And then short stories. Ruth, Esther, and Job are very much what we consider a short story. And I'm not making a judgment on true or not true. I'm just saying the form they're narratives, and they're really good narratives. Poetry and songs, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. We can't read a song as if it is, an instruction for us. It's poetry, it's songs. Think how when we read that, it's just a whole different experience. And then, of course, the prophets. Now, prophets get a bad rap as foreseers. That's really not what it is. It's more preaching, really. If you continue on this path that we know is not pleasing to God, this is what is going to happen. And so we have the big ones, and then the 12 groups called Micah, Amos, Micah, Malachi, all those guys. And then, of course, letters. Both Pauline and then others with Paul's name on them that we don't think he wrote. But also the letters are intended for different kinds of purposes. Some of them are instructional to a specific church congregation, like the Corinthians, quit doing that, do that. Some of them are more theological, like Romans. Some of them were intended to be passed around as general, like Ephesians, more general instructions. And then they have pastoral letters to Timothy and Titus, telling them how to be pastors, how to do this work. And then general letters that we don't really know who wrote, Hebrews, James, that kind of thing. And remember, again, that there was no such thing as plagiarism. And then, I don't know that I've got that spelled right, apocryphal. Is that right, Dennis? We're going to call it that. Apocryphal literature is, now when we read Daniel last night, that was a part of Daniel that was narrative. But then part of Daniel goes into apocalyptic literature. Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation. A lot of the folks back then knew how to read that, the numerology, the symbolism. Whereas we have some of our fundamentalist friends who read that as fact. I literally, when I was covering religion for the Greenville News, I was doing something with that Rapture series of books by Jenkins. Hayes and Jenkins. Yeah, Left Behind. And I went out to Bob Jones to ask them something about it. They literally have printouts of a timeline taken from the book of Revelation, how they have interpreted, 144, all those kinds of things that lay out when these things are supposed to happen. And that's what, you see from time to time predictions that the world will end, and the world will end, and the world will end. Well, it never does, and I think there is. But it's misreadings of apocryphal literature. And I think if the writers of that literature had ever known people 2,000 years from now are going to be taking this as fact, what? So,
Krista Gonzalez referred to that as reading Revelation as if it were the TV guide.
Yes, absolutely. And so, but I think to some extent, all of us look at the Bible as, and not realizing the different genres. So, okay, all right, we're not going to beat that horse anymore. And then we come to my favorite part, the Gospels. The Gospels. Some people liken them to, because we have 4, obviously, in our Bible, and liken them to, I'm checking time here, to portrait painters, that each one gives a sort of a different view of Jesus, as if, not like a snapshot forward, but occasionally they're bringing in things. And I like to think of them as reporters. Because that was what excited me most when I got to seminary, having been a reporter at that point for 27 years. It was like, oh, these stories are so different that they have written. And even before the age of Fox News and MSNBC, there was, any of us in the business knew that reporters brought different things to stories. And often who a reporter was determined the arc of that story. Now, if it was a wreck or a fire or even a plane crash, 10 reporters are going to go out and come back with a very similar story. If it's pretty, bam, 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 bam. But then there were a lot of other stories that depended on who the reporter was. Number one, is this a story at all? Do I even see this as a story? And what would be the interesting part? For instance, back in around the 90s, Greenville City voted in a majority of women on city council. It's the first time that had ever been done in history. We always had male. And so it was like Deb Sofield, Michelle Shane, Chandra Dillard, Diane Smock,
Lillian Fleming.
Lily Robb Fleming, yeah, thank you. And so my editor sent the city hall reporter and said, go over there and do a story on how they see as their governments being different now that they're all in 5 women and 2 men. So he went over there, and the women said, no, there's no difference, there's no story here. So he came back, told the editor, they said there's no story. Well, my editor's like, there's got to be a difference in the way women look at things. So she turned to me and he said, I was the age of most of those women. I had done stories on most of them in other contexts. And he said, see if they will talk to you. So I went over there, and they told me that the night of the election, they had gotten on the elevator together, all 5 of them, and had made a vow. We are not going to talk about this. We're not going to make a big deal. There were women. We're just going to be city council members. And so I said, okay, I get that. Will you let me do a story? And they said yes, that, because they trusted, we had enough history together, and so I wrote a story on who these women were and how they thought things might be different. Now, on the other hand, if you sent me out to do something that I had to go through documents or look at spreadsheets with financial figures, that story wasn't get written. Because I glazed over, I didn't get it, it didn't make sense to me. And so it really depended on who the writer was. Well, that's what I truly believe happened with our gospel writers. We have something called the Streeter hypothesis. Back in the beginning of biblical scholarship, most scholars thought that Mark was Reader's Digest, abridged version. Didn't have any infancy stories, didn't have any resurrection stories, and they kind of ignored Mark. And they focused mainly on really Matthew, quite frankly. But then, at some point, I can't remember what it was, scholarship said, wait a minute, we were wrong. Mark was the skeleton. Mark was probably the earliest. And Matthew pulled from Mark, Luke pulled from Mark. And then, if y'all have these things, favorite stories once upon a time, this sheet, there's a bunch on the floor where the kids were. This shows when there's a story is only once in our Gospels, tells who wrote it. And so there are a whole lot like that. So we say there was, I don't want to get too much of the weeds on this, but we think there was a group of Jesus' sayings going around that we call that was available to all of them. And then Luke had some things that Mark didn't have, and so we call that L. He had a separate source. And then Matthew had some things that Mark didn't have, and so we call that M. So anyway, they're all pulling from different places. But I would also contend they're also including things that they think are important. They choose there's all kinds of stuff. These ones? Go ahead and take that one, sure, yeah. Okay. So then, because of what they think is important about Jesus depends on what they include. So we have Mark, who does not put anything in about the birth or the resurrection. We think he's a follower of Peter. Matthew, who possibly was the disciple Matthew. We just don't know. There again, that's that mystery I'm talking about, that I thought there would be consensus on this. There is not. Possibly Matthew, but he's the most Jewish of the writers. Emmanuel, God is with us. Just some fabulous stories and some fabulous material nobody else uses. John, of course, entirely different. Instead of having Jesus teaching parables, he has Jesus preaching in long discourses. But Luke is the writer we're going to be talking about this weekend. He's one of the synoptics, meaning Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Synoptic meaning same eye. They're kind of telling the same general story, even though they're picking and choosing different events. Their timeline is very, very similar. So they're seeing the same, whereas John is completely different. So and then the timeline we're talking about, Jesus dies around here about 30. Paul's letters are the first things to start circulating. Then Mark wrote 70 with the fall of the temple. Then a few years, 20 years later, maybe Luke and Matthew were pulling from theirs. And then John much later. Okay. But the interesting thing that I find about Luke is that the stories he adds, or the stories he uses, are about Jesus being born to shepherds, eating with tax collectors, touching lepers, traveling with women, allowing prostitutes to touch him, teaching about the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, and the Good Samaritan. Luke's the only one who tells us some of that. And finally, in his last moments on earth, he has Jesus conversing with a convicted thief on the cross beside him. I always said Luke was the gospel writer for Triton. Precisely because of that. Because his Jesus was far more associating with the lowly and the marginalized than anyone else. Now, I just got back from Israel, so I'm going to be insufferable. They're off the Sea of Galilee. There's what they call the Mount of the Beatitudes. And the tradition there is that is where Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. Well, it describes as gentle. It's really nothing like a mountain. But it goes up like this, and what the guys will tell you is that it would have made sense for Jesus to be preaching with his back to the Sea of Galilee, so his voice would travel. And that the people were probably seated above him on the mount, and he was speaking that way, hence the Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus himself was standing on a fairly level place, and that's why Luke called it, he said that Jesus preached his sermon on a level place. Maybe, but I would contend that they may have been making theological points. Matthew wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah in the tradition of Moses. He was writing mostly to Jewish readers, and he wanted them to see Jesus as the new Moses, who had given the Ten Commandments on a mountaintop, and or they did give it, and came, and so he portrays Jesus on this mountain, whereas Luke is consistently portraying Jesus among the lowlands, and so I think that's where we're getting that level of place. A friend of mine gave me this refrigerator magnet, and it says, it's Jesus preaching, looks like a sermon on the mountain. Okay, everyone, now listen carefully. I don't want to end up with 4 different versions of this. I love that the church did end up with 4 different versions of this. Now, of course, they kept a lot more out. There were a lot more of them than they didn't think. But to me, that showed an incredible amount of bravery and trust that we could read these 4 different gospels from 4 different writers that are not in lockstep by any means, and say, but there is truth in all of them. Facts might not just be bam, 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 but there is truth, and we can learn something from all of them. And I just think that is the most amazing thing in the world, that we have all 4 of these. And there were attempts at harmonization, and there was a document called the Testament. I did that right? I lost mine. So they were all squished together. But for whatever reason, and we think it was already about 150 AD that the Gospels were packaged as 4 and circulating among the churches. Okay? And so I love that the early church trusted us enough to do that. But to crack their mysteries of the gospel, I think we need to understand where those writers are coming from. I entered seminary in the year 2000 simply to learn more about my new religion, being on the breaking news. And even though I'd been in church all my life and knew a lot of these stories, I didn't understand how they were to be understood or how they hung together. And I was not even clear, I don't think, that the gospel writers told these different versions of stories. So as a reporter for myself over 2 decades by that point, I was mesmerized by what they had done and came out of seminary not as a journalist, but as a wannabe minister. So, would somebody read for us? We want to start with Luke 2, 8 through 20, and let's look at how Luke starts out right off the bat. Starts out with this, that's not on the printout, so you may have a Bible. Hey, you want to read it back? Or on the phone, or however everybody's going. Luke 2, 8 through 20.
There were some shepherds in that part of the country who were spending the night in the fields, taking care of their flocks. And the angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone over them. They were terribly afraid. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid. I am here with good news for you, which will bring great joy to all the people. This very day in David's town, your Savior was born, Christ the Lord. And this is what will prove it to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great army of heaven's angels appeared with the angel, singing praises to God. Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to those with whom he is pleased. When the angels went away from them back into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and saw the baby lying in the manger. When the shepherds saw them, they told them what the angel All who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said. Mary remembered all these things and thought deeply about them. The shepherds went back, singing praises to God for all they had heard and seen. It had been just as the angel had told them.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Oh, by the way, I don't think I think the best thing is just if you need to go to the restroom, it's fine, just get up and go, because I don't think we'll try to go push right on through until 11:30. Now, I don't know about you, but I always thought of shepherds the whole time I was growing up in church and Sunday school as adorable children in bathrobes in our church. But that's where we get it from. 21st century readers. At the time Luke was writing, shepherds were distrusted people, disposable people. Even today, the Bedouin shepherds that I saw in Israel live out in the Judean wilderness. And I am telling you, that is barren, forsaken, unforgiving land out there. And they live in these constructed shacks or lean-tos. It's a hard and unforgiving life. One of the most vivid images I carried from seminary is when a professor likened these shepherds to our modern-day carnival workers. Carnies. That was the closest metaphor he had. Well, I have been an avid carnival goer all my life. From Myrtle Beach to Six Flags to Carowinds to the Greenville County Fair to carnivals erected in the Walmart parking lot of Berea. Carnies are invisible people to those of us who ride their rides, who buy their cotton candy, who sneak wide-eyed into the tents to see the cow with the head of a human baby. They are rough-looking men and bleach-blonde women who run the Ferris wheel and the sideshows and lure teenagers into losing money throwing baseballs at milk bottles. They had tattoos in a time that the rest of us didn't. And they live in run-down trailers behind the tilt-a-whirl. They scream endlessly into bullhorns, trying to get upstate farm boys into sad hoochie-coochie shows and sadder freak shows. I actually met more than one carnival worker at Triune. They had been traveling with circuses and got injured when they were putting up tents in Greenville, and they got left behind when the circuses moved on. They couldn't go with them, so they became homeless and moved out to the woods. Well, like our modern-day parties, shepherds were the lowest, most distrusted people in the ancient world. The assumption that they lied was so prevalent that their testimony was not accepted in law courts. They were the invisible people, and they were the very people entrusted with the news that God had come to earth. Luke's entire gospel talks about Jesus eating with tax collectors, healing lepers, welcoming women as followers, allowing prostitutes to touch him. And here in the beginning, we see this story in miniature, the baby laid in a manger, a feeding trough for animals. As an aside, in Bethlehem, we actually saw where they think the manger was, and it was stone. I had always pictured it as wood. And the shepherds were the first witnesses. Do you see what Luke is doing? The adult Jesus, who would care for disposable, marginalized people, isn't very far from this stable in Bethlehem, surrounded by disposable, marginalized shepherds. What a brilliant piece of writing. There is I've got two. I don't think I made it in here. There is a theologian named Raymond Brown who wrote a whole book about the adult Christ at Christmas. And he talks about how Luke writes his story this way because he's going to be writing about a Savior of disposable people. And what does Matthew do? Matthew writes a whole different story of foreign kings coming to worship Jesus, is maybe a 2-year-old, because he's trying to present Jesus as this, royalty. And so you have the essence of those gospels written into the infancy narratives. Yeah.
How did they write it, like 90 years after it happened?
There you go. And how did that? How did that? Because by the time of the crucifixion, a lot of people were watching. They had their eyes on Jesus. And that's why the synoptic gospels most closely agree about that material around the crucifixion. Who was watching in the days of the birth? We don't know. So so Matthew fashions this narrative about foreign kings. Luke says he researched. We don't know what that means, but that's what he came up with.
Have you seen The Chosen? Has anybody seen that series, The Chosen? Epic. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's epic.
I think I've seen one episode, yeah.
It's phenomenal. So there's a part in there where the subject's a little older, and Luke is writing feverishly to get complete the birth story, right? And at the same time, during that episode, Mary Magdalene is meeting with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary was telling Mary, again, that part is, I don't know if it's fictionalized or not, I don't know if it happened, could have happened. So she's telling her the actual story of what happened in that manger. So Mary Magdalene has this information, and she knows that Luke is writing. So she goes to Luke, this is how the episode ends. She goes to Luke, and she says, I just sat down with Mother Mary, and she gave me the information. This is exactly what happened. And he dismisses her and says, I have already written that. Not even talking to her. The only one there was Mary. So it was interesting because how much did he research?
Wow.
He had potentially a first-hand account, but it didn't flow perhaps within the framework of putting the meat on the bones that he was trying to do as a brilliant author.
Exactly, and that's what Mark said, to what was true, and who this Jesus is going to be. He's going to be somebody who was surrounded by disposable, marginalized people from the beginning. Beautiful story.
Yeah, to me, one of the most powerful things is about the way Luke chooses his words and saying about the shepherds, what they're going to be doing. He says, they heard, they saw, they went. You have put in this other thought about how marginalized, but they believed, and it was just as the angel said. So the choice of words was no, it was also, yes, this is what happened. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't like a marginalized person being heard. It was like someone believing it was being heard. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying, yeah.
And I think that so often in our world, we don't believe what marginalized people are.
Oh, yeah, very good. Absolutely.
I don't think I'm giving anything away really for those who haven't read your books yet, but I love the fact that it is a marginalized person who sees himself as invisible, who helps to solve all the cases.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the few people who listen to it.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that. Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for now.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I appreciate it. Okay, we're going to try to read before
11:02.
11:02, okay. Yeah, we're doing all right, I think. Okay, now, The second reading I want us to look at is the one y'all should have in your seats, and there's some more scattered around if y'all have it. And this is one of the most important, I think, pieces of scripture we have. Is this Jesus preaching his first sermon in his hometown synagogue. Anybody else need something? There's nothing.
Let me ask you this. Luke's account of Jesus is being marginalized. Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition, has about 7-page section in which she says, and I think she's right about this, that what is distinctive, what is unique about Jesus is that he introduces for the first time to the human community, to the world, the possibility of reconciling all the world by means of forgiveness. That Jesus says, stop all the warfare, stop all the nastiness of the world. The way to redeem the world is to forgive our enemies. Now, her contention is, as I said, this is what makes Jesus unique. Jürgen Habermas takes up this idea and says that when the world's reconciled to itself, that we're all reconciled to each other, not only is human history redeemed, but the God of history is redeemed. That redemption is not possible unless God is involved in it in such a way that God is also redeemed. As long as human history is in trouble, God is not redeemed. I love the idea. I don't know how to articulate it fully, but I do like the idea. But all of it has to do, I think, Jesus is going to the marginalized, and as you say, allowing prostitutes to touch it. Somebody read this point years ago. My father's been 28 years. But when somebody mentioned this to my father, he started singing, that old time religion. I'm not sure I made a point.
All right, so everybody, the reading. Well, Dr. Johnson, you made the point. I don't need to reiterate. We need to know 2 background stories before we look at this. Number one, these are, he references some Old Testament stories in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. The first story is the widow of Zarephath, which you probably remember. Elijah, there was a drought in the land, and God sends Elijah to this widow in Zarephath, and he asks her for some bread and water, and she says, I'm just getting ready to bake my last little bit of bread. I've got just enough meal and oil to make my son and I one more meal, and then we're going to die from this drought. And he says, if you will feed me, the Lord will take care of you. And so sure enough, she makes bread for him, and then her jar of meal miraculously refills, and her jug of oil miraculously refills until the drought ends. Okay, that's story number one. Story number 2 is Elijah. Elijah has gone to heaven, and now Elisha is the prophet of Israel. And there's a Syrian army commander, another Gentile, named Naaman, and he has leprosy. And he has a slave girl from the children of Israel in his household. And she says, I understand there's a prophet who can heal you. And so he goes to his king, and his king sends him to Israel's king, who sends him to Elisha. And Elisha says, go and wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Well, Naaman's just furious, because don't we have better rivers than that in Damascus? And, but his men prevail on him and say, give it a try, we're going to lose. So he goes down in the Jordan, washes 7 times, and comes out clean. Okay, so that's the background. Now, would somebody read for us this, it's kind of lengthy, but read for us this passage from Luke's version.
And will you do it with the microphone?
Oh, good, yeah,
Right
good,
here.
yeah, good idea.
Okay. All right, Luke 4:16-30. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did in Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elijah, and none of them was cleansed, except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way.
Okay, now, as you can probably tell, the stories in Mark and Matthew are much shorter. We can tell they're probably coming from the same incident of the preaching in his hometown, and they have very similar themes about these prophets are without honor except in their hometown, and curing the sick and all that. Luke is the one who adds this whole section about the Gentiles, okay? In Luke's story alone, Jesus pointed out these occasions when Elijah and Elisha, two of the most storied of Israel's prophets, cured Gentiles, outsiders, unclean people, people who would not have been in the synagogue on that day, people who would not have been in the synagogue any day. They were welcome. This good news that Jesus was introducing to his neighbors was for outsiders as well as insiders. His gospel was for the poor, the captives, the blind, and the oppressed that he read about from the scroll of Isaiah. His gospel was for the starving widows and the arrogant soldiers of their nations. And his listeners did not take his message well. They grabbed Jesus, dragged him to the hilltop overlooking their town, and tried to hurl him off. They were so enraged that they tried to murder Jesus, their hometown boy. Why? For suggesting that the Lord that they worshiped also loved a poor Gentile widow and a leprous Gentile army commander, for suggesting that his gospel might be rejected by the insiders and accepted by the outsiders. Now, in Luke's version, where good Jews aged that Jesus thought it was fine to accept a poor Gentile widow and a Gentile army commander, it's not too great a leap to see our modern day connections. What are the things sure to turn Christians in the church murderous today. To suggest that God loves drug addicts and ex-criminals, gang members. To suggest that God loves Muslims and Hindus, Buddhists. To suggest that God loves homosexuals. It's so easy for us to point to the widows of Zarephath and the leprous Syrian soldiers and say those Jews in the synagogue should have known that God loved them, because those people aren't living among us. Gentile widows and leprous soldiers are not our hot buttons. But we have other people who are our hot buttons. I'll never forget now when ex-President Trump was building that wall on our border, and the Washington Post sent down a reporter to a church down there near the border. And they were wanting that wall up, and they were anti-immigrant. And the reporter said, but how do you read the passages where Jesus tells us to love our neighbor? And a woman responded, he meant our American neighbor. Wow.
Not even all of them. Not even all of them. Serving on Mount Rushmore.
All right. So, I took what I was learning about this Jesus who was announced by shepherds, stood alongside marginalized Gentiles, and I went to work at the Triune Mercy Center. Everybody been there? No, okay, good, thank you, because y'all were just so great about supporting this. I wrote in the Weight of Mercy some of the things that happened, because I was completely outside my comfort zone. And as I worked, two things hit me very, very quickly. Two things, yeah. And this man said this to me very early. Do you know the worst thing about being homeless? It's not being cold or wet or hungry. The worst thing about being homeless is being looked right through. And I can't tell you how much that turned my idea of our ministry back on its head, because at that point, I think we started to move from sheer giveaways, food and clothes and kerosene and everything in the world, to coming alongside and inviting in and serving with dignity and trying to not have that donor-recipient model, but let's all come to the table together and all bring our gifts. And you are expected to use your gifts, take up the offering, read the responsive reading, give out, serve communion, give out brochures, whatever. You're equal here, and we invite you to participate as everybody else would. So, after I wrote The Weight of Mercy, about a year later, my publisher's in England, and he asked me if I would write a sequel. And I said, no, I think I've said everything that I had to say in that. But, I've always wanted to write a murder mystery. And he said, really? I said, yeah. And he said, well, we're starting the fiction line, so we'll take a look at that. So, write what you know. That's what we tell writers, isn't it? So I made the amateur detective a newspaper reporter, Brandon Powers. And I made her friend a pastor to the homeless, Liam Delaney. And I figured between them, they could cover everything I knew. For the center of the plot, I pulled on this idea that a homeless man had said to me, and that I absolutely never got out of my mind. Pastor, do you know the worst thing about being homeless? Not being cold or wet or hungry. The worst thing about being homeless is being looked right through. Well, that was pretty much the premise for our work at Triune. We tried everything we could. Art, music, theater, gardening, volunteering, letting in Lynn Mitchell to lift people up. But what might that mean that invisibility mean in a murder mystery? What might it mean if a whole group of people were unseen, invisible, ignored? What might they see? What might they know? And out of that music, as our friend said, download faith. While Brannigan and Liam are trying to solve a 10-year-old murder, there's a shadowy homeless figure gliding through the story. Because he's all but invisible, Malachi sees things they don't, and he hears things they don't. Is he the murderer, or is he the detective? Okay, Lane, can we show our slide now? This is, anybody recognize this? This is under the Fee Hollis Corridor Bridge. And this is Angela. She was one of our women. And, it's kind of a typical situation. She, I think, was probably pretty mentally low functioning. She had about 5 children, and they were all being raised by various family members. And, we tried to convince her to come inside or get housing or something, and we didn't have much luck. But so we were, this is what we were dealing with, and this is what I wanted to show. And so here's how I introduced this idea of being invisible. Malachi has been getting coffee at church and talking to Brandon. And he heads out. He lingered a half hour over 2 more cups of coffee and a year-old Sports Illustrated from the dining hall rack. There were more articles he wanted to read, so he slid the magazine into his faded backpack. Didn't mind, so long as she brought it back. See, I'm always trying to justify myself. He slipped his arms into the backpack straps. He was traveling light today, having left his bedroll, duffel bag, and canned food in his tent under the bridge. And that was exactly where I said this story, where he lived. He wasn't sure they'd be there when he returned. It was a warm June morning, as good a day to live outside as Georgia offered. The flower beds flanking Jericho Road, which is the homeless shelter, were filled with daylilies and verbena, as well as blooms on the roses. He liked to weed and water the beds, but today we needed neither. He shifted his pack to better balance the weight between his shoulders, then set out for the Grambling courthouse. It wasn't the courthouse he wanted, not by a long shot. He'd seen the inside of the municipal court 4 times, and he could count. Vagrancy, lordry, trespassing, urinating in public. Being homeless wasn't illegal, but being a human and doing human things outside was. One thing he was proud of, no panhandling charges. 14 years on the streets and did not panhandle once. He'd gone hungry, Lord knows. Hungry and wet and cold and shaped and sick and hot and mosquito bitten and lice infested and weary as a man can be. He'd eaten 3 meals at every church, restaurant, hospital room, and jail cell that offered. But it was always by invitation, never because he went begging. The distinction was important to him. Still, the grassy square that surrounded the courthouse was shady and well stocked with benches. It was his favorite place to read on days as fine as this one. He covered the 6 blocks to Main Street easily. Most days he walked 11 miles, he once calculated. Since it wasn't yet 10 a.m., the benches were deserted except for other homeless people. Malachi recognized everyone except the tall and beefy white dude, mid-30s, his work pants streaked with red mud, his hooded brown eyes darting restlessly over the square. Was he vaguely familiar? No, maybe not. Malachi hoped he was just passing through. Clearly bad news. He ducked out of the white dude's line of sight and found a bench under a massive oak. He was engrossed in a story about soccer in the slums of South America when a professionally dressed man, maybe 35, walked over and sat on the bench 3 feet away. The man was on his cell phone, and he looked right at Malachi. Oh, babe, you know what had happened. She'd take the house and the kids. Her old man has so much clout, I'd lose my job too. You have to be patient and we have to be careful. So careful, you're letting a perfect stranger hear you're cheating on your wife? Malachi thought. I mean, the man was looking right at him. It wasn't the first time. He told Pastor Liam about it. The worst thing about being homeless is being looked right through. Pastor Liam was something of a crazy white guy himself, but he got it. He told Malachi, he quoted him every time he gave a speech. The man finished his conversation and jammed his phone into a holster on his belt. Muttering to himself, he got up and walked back into the courthouse. Malachi wondered if he had stabbed someone as the man was talking. Stabbed someone right here in the open. Would Mr. Cheating cell-phone guy be able to describe him to the police? In my 15 years of Triumph, I dealt with homeless people every single day. And it became so commonplace, I didn't think anything about it. But most people don't have that context. And I don't think many of our characters in literature portray it either. So I'm going to show that side of society, to show actual people who were homeless. But if they are homeless, something has gone terribly wrong in their lives. Think about that for a moment. If you or your spouse suddenly lost your job or your retirement income, would you be homeless? I sort of doubt it. Most of us have some sort of safety net. Savings, or a parent, or a child, or a sibling, or an aunt, or a cousin, or a friend who would take us in. Many years ago, my grandparents died and left their farm in Georgia, where all was said, to my mother and her brother. And when they sold it, they had to invest in more real estate, or they were going to owe a whole lot of taxes. So my parents bought up the mortgages on my house and my brothers and sisters' houses. And we used to laugh that if we missed a house payment, the last thing my parents were going to do was evict us. Because they knew that my husband and I and our 3 children and dog would move in with them. Now, while we might not all have that specific scenario, we probably have some kind of network to catch us. But the people at Triumph did not. The people that are living in those tents did not. They had severed all their relationships. There was quite literally no one who could or would take them in. So whether the precipitating issue was a divorce, or job loss, or illness, or injury, or addiction, or mental illness, the truth was it was the absence of a relationship that was the most devastating issue. I was trying to show that, the camera thing. And I was also trying to give a glimpse of what characters' lives might have been like before they were on the street. Because almost anybody you meet on the street was not born there. That was not a lifelong condition. I remember talking to an older gentleman during my early years at Triumph, and he said, I worked all my life. If you'd have told me I'd ever been in this situation, I would have called you a liar. And so we learned that Malachi grew up in a relatively stable family, aided by his grandparents. He was an honor student, a veteran. He had a drinking problem. That something has gone terribly wrong. And we meet Rita Mae Jones. When we meet her, she is a shriveled, mean, foul-mouthed alcoholic. But over the course of the book, we learned that she grew up in a middle-class home and developed a taste for cocaine. And Rita voices her disdain for people like me who wanted to get people out of homelessness. There's this passage in her head. Even the folks at St. James and Jericho Road who fed you, those meals didn't come without strings. They all talked about helping the homeless. Lord, did they talk. But what they meant was they wanted to help you not be homeless. They came right out and said it. No one wanted to help you get what you really needed, which was basically a living. So, the Kamloops thief's concerned with disposable came from the weight of mercies concerned with disposable people, which came from the gospel writer Luke's concern with the disposable people. The biggest question on the minds of people 2,000 years ago, when Jesus preached his first sermon in his hometown synagogue, was how could God possibly love those people, that Gentile widow and that Gentile army commander? The biggest question, I think, on the minds of Christians today, how could God possibly love those people? Okay, we've got about 4 minutes, and now it's your turn. Questions, comments, concerns?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
One day I was walking in my neighborhood, which is near Triton, and this guy comes up and wants money. And I said, I'm not giving you any money, and you can tell right around the corner. And he said, I don't want those homeless sandwiches. And I thought, yeah, 2 pieces of white bread, and yeah, I don't want those homeless sandwiches.
Yep. Did everybody get to hear that? That was probably the hardest thing, was getting through the annoyance and things like that, and the scammers and the criminality, to get to the people who really wanted and would accept help, and who you were honestly helping, as opposed to continuing an addiction. And figuring out what was what, and making mistakes every single day on it.
Then I was fortunate to be in one of the tours that you organized for people who would like to experience and understand the work you were doing for us in Greenville. And I just very distinctly remember our visit under the bridge.
Oh, okay.
From coming outside to the inside, somebody had written in red paint, God is love. And I thought, my God, they get it. They get it. And here they are, the least of these, the ones that you think maybe don't.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I saw more faith under there. Also, this is a good picture. Thanks, Hank, for changing that picture. You see up at the top of that incline, it's kind of dark, but there were probably another 8 people living up there. And it wasn't that high, but they could almost be apartments, with blankets or cardboard or something separating them. It was just incredible. Yeah.
Later on, I was mentoring somebody that was joining the church, young girl, and we needed to do something in the community. And I said, would you like to go visit? We were supposed to visit another church with another faith, and we were Presbyterian. So we decided the other person would be Methodist, and we go to St. James. That was the most meaningful worship service either of us had ever been to. The active participation of everybody there was so alive with the love of God. It was incredible. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
About a year ago, our Mission and Witness Committee read this book called Having Nothing, Possessing Everything. Michael Mallett is a pastor, Methodist pastor. And everything you said today reminds me of this book, because the biggest takeaway, and it has revolutionized the way that we engage in mission, the biggest takeaway for us was that it's so easy to look in a community and see only deficit. Whereas this book challenged us to look to where other people see deficit and instead see abundance, which is what you were just saying. And if we come into those relationships thinking that we have abundance and they have deficit,
then we miss the work of the Spirit. And so, just wanted to say this really clicked with what we've been doing, Mission and Witness, for a very long time. And Just Faith, all of our Just Faithers would say the same thing.
Well, and I can't tell you how much I appreciated churches like yours who got it. Because, and I'm sure Jean will back me up on this, there are churches out there who would pull up into our parking lot and serve with food a half an hour before we had a church serving a hot meal. Well, that completely undermines our church partner who had gone out and bought the groceries, cooked and all this, because now people really were hungry. And they thought I guess their intentions were good, but they were completely undermining us. Same thing, giving out tennis shoes, just, willy-nilly, or sleeping bags. When we knew the great majority of them were going into crack houses. They were going to buy more drugs. And so people with the best, we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but people with the best intentions, just giving, and actually it was hurting, because it was hurting what we were trying to do as far as building relationships, building dignity, inviting you to bring your gifts in.
You guys can really not too long, that when you volunteer, the best part, when giving hurts.
When helping hurts, yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Yes. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. When helping hurts and toxic charity, big fan of both of those, yeah. Okay, we've run over our time, so yeah.
Thank you very much, Deb. I believe that we are heading to lunch at noon. I believe there's still, I don't have where are we on time?
That's right.
So, feel free to use restrooms here. And for those of you who aren't aware, the dining hall is through this parking lot and straight back here. I'm sure some of our familiar people will kind of lead the way. Just walk through the parking lot and you'll be there in 5 minutes.
And remember,